been selected to receive the sneak peek about a phenomenon called Pokémon, a hit TV show, a Game Boy game, and loads of other cool things that are about to take America by storm! Gotta catch 'em all! Gotta catch 'em all!
The day this promotional Toys R Us VHS arrived in my family's mailbox was the day my life changed forever. That's truly not an exaggeration. I've actually been procrastinating on writing this script simply because it feels too daunting. Pokémon is a generation-defining work, and especially so for those old enough to have been the target audience when it first showed up. Most media franchises on Earth could only wish to hit the level of instant success that Pokémon did. And that success was something Nintendo kinda needed at the time. During the mid-90s, Nintendo was losing a bit of steam. After being somewhat humbled by Sega and their little blue engine that could, they were taking their sweet time getting their next home console just right. And in that time, new competitor Sony hit the market with their PlayStation and completely one-upped them. A turn of events that one could call karma for Nintendo's public betrayal of Sony just a few years earlier. To fill the gap in their console releases, and to hopefully replace the long-aging Game Boy, Nintendo would release the Virtual Boy, a portable machine capable of 32-bit 3D graphics rendering. What Nintendo didn't expect was for the Virtual Boy to fall flat on its face. It didn't just flop, it failed spectacularly. Not only was it a disappointment in sales, being Nintendo's lowest-selling console to this very day at less than 800,000 units sold. Seriously, even the Sega 32X sold more. Critically, it was considered one of the worst products ever made. It was advertised as a portable, but definitely wasn't. It was a bulky, binocular-esque headset that left you completely blind, and usually requiring that you uncomfortably lean into a tripod. You couldn't just hold it in front of your face, either, since the thing required a controller. Its graphics were also rendered in these harsh black and red wire frames that really did a number on your eyes. And the Virtual Boy also wasn't at all built for multiplayer, or even for simple spectating, since the headset nature of the device meant it was strictly made for one person at a time. A lot of the Virtual Boy's initial proposed features ended up cut or drastically scaled down for the sake of affordability and/or health concerns. And with the majority of Nintendo's focus at the time being on finishing the N64, this resulted in a final product that felt half-assed and almost irritating to play. It was just a litany of poor design decisions all rolled into one, and was instantly derided as one of the worst gaming consoles in history. After the Philips CDI fiasco, Nintendo once again found themselves humbled and embarrassed, with nobody to really blame but themselves. But, just as Nintendo hadn't expected the Virtual Boy to flop, something else happened that they hadn't seen coming. Nintendo had decided to hitch their wagon to a humble, low-budget Game Boy RPG, bankrolling what was essentially an indie passion project, almost solely due to Shigeru Miyamoto having faith in what was being made. And that little indie RPG, one might even say a pocket-sized monster, would end up breathing new life into the Game Boy for years to come. And right as Nintendo desperately needed a hit. I feel like I don't even need to tell you what Pokémon is. We all know what Pokémon is. In its less than 30 years of existence, it's become the highest-grossing media franchise of all time, at nearly $100 billion as of 2024. And that makes its humble beginnings all the more surprising and admirable. It's something you rarely see in any form of media, let alone gaming. A small-scale passion project that somehow manages to find massive worldwide success. The most recent other example I can think of is Minecraft, a game made almost entirely by a single person that's also managed to become a ridiculously popular media empire. But back in the day, back before Pokémon was well and truly the biggest thing on planet Earth, it kinda still was the biggest thing on planet Earth. At least it felt that way if you were a child.
Be forewarned if you haven't been already, the hottest thing in the 12 and under set is coming soon to a theater near you. Pokémon the movie joins Pokémon the video game and Pokémon the trading card as must-sees and must-haves. To start us off tonight, NBC News correspondent Colleen Dominguez on the craze that has now hit Hollywood.
Many school officials think the craze has gone too far.
They're not allowed at our school because it's such a craze and people like them so much they tend to steal.
School officials are finding that Pokemon cards are responsible for fistfights, and the constant trading is not only distracting kids from classwork, but turning the playground into a black market.
Now, he has 3 fingers, and those 3 fingers are always sticking out like that. But if they were the 3, on us, they'd be this. It means Hail Satan.
But some experts say the entire Pokemon phenomenon is the enemy.
In my opinion, parents should not let their kids watch Pokemon, play Pokemon, buy Pokemon cards, have anything whatsoever to do with Pokemon, because the message is violence.
He's cute. But the one thing I've noticed about him right off, this is Pikachu, one thing I noticed about him right off was his tail. It's a lightning bolt, and it's a satanic Z.
Never in my 30-odd years have I seen a single franchise so instantly, so widely, and so firmly take a complete chokehold on popular culture the way the original Pokémon did. The term Pokémania was coined in the West to describe the phenomenon. The Pokémon TV show was the talk of the playground. The Pokémon trading cards were causing such distraction and even fights during school hours that many American schools banned them. Christian evangelists and grifters were starting to claim that Pokémon was satanic and/or indoctrinating American youth into some nebulous Japanese mind cult.
And it's a satanic Z.
Kids absolutely loved it, to the point where our parents were sick and tired of how much we loved it. But what is the appeal of Pokémon? What is it about this little indie game that managed to take hold of us the way it did? Well, I have a few guesses. Pokémon taps into a lot of things that kids find irresistible, first of all being the never-ending and insatiable desire to collect stuff. It doesn't matter what, kids just want to collect things. Perhaps this is a social compulsion that's died down with the more recent generations, but for millennials in the 90s, this was the age of Pogs and Beanie Babies. We were surrounded by products whose primary purpose was to get as many of them as possible, and Pokémon tapped into that mania effortlessly. The idea behind Pokémon is to collect all the different monsters. It was right there in the game's tagline, "Gotta catch 'em all." And boy did we all try to. The central gameplay concept of trading Pokémon was the result of Satoshi Tajiri's experience with JRPGs of the late 80s and early 90s. Specifically, while playing Dragon Quest II, he was having no luck achieving a certain rare item drop, but when his friend Ken Sugimori revealed he had gotten 2 of that item, Tajiri found himself wishing there was a way to trade items between games. While this wasn't possible on the Famicom, Tajiri did note that the Game Boy was capable of linking 2 devices together, and yet there were very few games that utilized this capability to its full potential. Tajiri would go on to combine this idea with his childhood love of bug collecting, a popular pastime among children in his younger days that had grown less and less prevalent over time as Japan became more urbanized, resulting in bug populations dwindling. Seeking a way to recapture his love of the hobby in a video game, he came up with the idea of a game about collecting and trading monsters that encouraged interaction with other players in order to achieve a complete collection. The idea of monsters being caught and kept inside small containers, or in this case balls, was inspired by the capsule monsters from Ultraman, and in fact the working title for the game would be Capsule Monsters for several years. Obviously this ran into trademark issues and so would eventually be changed. At the time, Tajiri ran Game Freak, a small independent gaming magazine, alongside his friend Ken Sugimori, an illustrator. The magazine was completely handmade and sold locally by Tajiri himself, but the funds amassed over the years would eventually allow Game Freak to expand into full-on game development in 1989. Bit by bit, this monster trading game concept would be built alongside Game Freak's other projects, beginning in earnest by 1990. Upon pitching the idea to Nintendo that year, Tajiri was met with very little enthusiasm, as Nintendo felt the concept was too ambitious for a Game Boy game and also failed to understand its appeal. Shigeru Miyamoto, however, saw promise in the idea and basically single-handedly got the game greenlit for development under Nintendo's umbrella. A few more people gradually joined the dev team as the years passed, and while the team set an initial goal of creating 50 in-game monsters, the final game would feature a whopping for the time 150, after reportedly 3 years was spent designing hundreds of pieces of concept art and whittling those down into a select group of favorites. In the end, Pocket Monsters Red and Green would launch in February 1996, nearly 6 years after being initially conceived. As time went on, the name would be colloquially shortened... That word sucks. I know, Ferris, it sucks. As time went on, the name would be colloquially shortened to simply Pokémon, a name that would become official branding before long. The idea of releasing two similar companion games at once was born of the trading concept, and while Pokémon wasn't the first game to use this split game design model, it definitely was the game that popularized it. Since the team wanted to encourage players to interact with one another, they wanted to make sure it was impossible to collect every Pokémon on a single cartridge. Within the game, players use their own Pokémon creatures to subdue and capture wild Pokémon. And between the two versions, a handful of monsters are exclusive to one or the other, requiring players of one version to seek out and organize trades with players of the other. Within the game, certain Pokémon also evolve into stronger monsters under various conditions, but a few will only evolve upon being traded to another player, further incentivizing players to cooperate. Furthermore, the game offers the player one of 3 starter Pokémon of their choosing, and trading between games is the only way to get the other 2 starters on the same save file. Of the 150 monsters, and assuming you go out of your way to evolve every one you can, you'll only be able to obtain 123 on a single cartridge, and there will still be 4 or 5 Pokémon left that you haven't even seen. And that brings us to the other thing that made Pokémon so enticing to children. The desire to have your own magical animal or monster companion is something that I feel is pretty universal among grade school-aged kids. Released the same year as Pokémon was the first Tamagotchi, which proved to be instantly popular, and Pokémon's premise arguably revolves around a similar idea as Tamagotchi. While there are a handful of Pokémon that can be described as monsters, within the setting of the game, many of them are more akin to fantasy versions of existing animals. Stuff like pigeons, mice, fish, mollusks, dogs, foxes, cats, and of course various insects. One particular species of Pokémon even has visibly distinct male and female variants. While this does bring up a few questionable moral implications when it comes to capturing these creatures and forcing them to fight, the game makes a point of saying that Pokémon enjoy fighting, and mistreating Pokémon is almost universally frowned upon. Moreover, Tajiri made a point that Pokémon never die during battle, only faint, as he didn't want to further contribute to what he saw as the needless violence of many video games. Nope, everything is quite literally fun and games in the world of Pokémon. And that was something that stuck out to me as I was replaying these games. The game features random wild encounters like any other RPG, but in addition to those are trainer battles, where an NPC will challenge you to a Pokémon battle if you talk to them or walk into their eyeline. It doesn't seem like that big a deal, but having the world inhabited with NPCs that act as an actual ever-present game mechanic makes the entire world feel more lived in. Rather than NPCs being there solely as exposition dumps or side quest dispensers, these trainer battles really establish how Pokémon are seen as completely normal in this world, and that you're far from the only one on a quest to become a Pokémon master. Like, you'll go into a cave and see a bunch of other trainers trying to get through that same cave, and then another group of trainers taking a break once you finally reach the other side. Trainers make small talk with you before and after each battle, and some other trainers even offer to trade Pokémon with you. Shops sell Pokémon-specific items and vitamins, and there's an entire pre-established healthcare system built around treating Pokémon specifically. In this world, Pokémon aren't just a hobby, but a part of everyday life. You're not some destined hero character, you're just a small part of the world, motivated only by a desire to prove your greatness. In hindsight, Pokémon also gives off a lot of EarthBound vibes, which I guess isn't all that surprising given that it was co-developed by Creatures Inc., one half of the dev team that created EarthBound. Each Pokémon trainer can carry a team of up to 6 Pokémon, and they fight one-on-one in turn-based fashion. Each Pokémon can learn up to 4 different techniques to use, each with their own individual usage cost, here called Power Points, or PP. There is no defend option in battle, and while the player can flee from wild Pokémon, trainer battles are locked in, making PP conservation a prevalent gameplay mechanic. Each species of Pokémon has a preset element or pair of elements that determine which types of attacks are and are not effective against them, and this forms the crux of the game's strategy. With 150 Pokémon in total and 15 different possible elements, this creates a lot of different possibilities when it comes to battle matchups. The process of capturing wild Pokémon is simple but requires some finesse. Wild Pokémon can be encountered anywhere where there's tall grass, as well as by fishing, in caves, and in 2 specific instances, abandoned buildings. Once found, wild Pokémon can be captured in Pokéballs, but a Pokémon at full health is going to put up a hell of a fight staying in the balls you throw. Instead, the best method for capturing Pokémon is to first whittle its health down as low as possible without actually knocking it out, and inflicting status conditions such as paralysis, sleep, or freezing will also increase your odds. But if the Pokémon faints, the fight ends and your chance is gone. Logistically, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You'd think knocking out a Pokémon would make it easier to catch, no? But as a gameplay mechanic, this is great. It teaches the player restraint when it comes to depleting their opponent's HP, holding back so as not to completely decimate them. Once a Pokémon is caught, it can be either added to your team or transferred to a PC storage system. And if it's the first Pokémon of that species that you've caught, its information will also be recorded into your Pokédex, an encyclopedia that tracks which of the game's 150 monsters you've managed to collect. And as long as you've at least seen a specific Pokémon, you can look up its possible locations in your Pokédex to help in tracking one down for yourself. Once certain amounts of Pokémon are obtained, you can receive certain items that can help you in your quest. Most of these are optional and unnecessary for finishing the game, but can have cool tertiary uses such as splitting EXP gain between all your current Pokémon, or helping you find hidden items. As the game goes on, you're able to purchase Great and Ultra Balls that improve your catching odds, but the basic strategy always remains the same, to get a Pokémon as close to fainting as you can. During one story event, you're also rewarded a single Master Ball, which can catch any wild Pokémon without fail, no exceptions. But you only ever get the one, so choose wisely. I'm about to piss a lot of people off, watch this. Awesome. Now let me just... Perfect. Mechanically, Pokémon act as this game's version of traditional RPG party members. Battles are turn-based one-on-one skirmishes where experience points are gained upon victory, shared among any monsters who participated in defeating each enemy. Trainer battles will also reward the player with some cash as well. Additionally, there is a Pokémon daycare that can be used to passively grant experience points to a single Pokémon simply by walking. As Pokémon level up, they learn a number of techniques in a preset order and can retain up to 4 at a time. Certain Pokémon also evolve when meeting various criteria, most commonly by reaching a specific level, which will increase their base stats across the board, but also causes them to learn any future attacks at later levels than they otherwise would. 2 other evolution methods also exist, Stone Evolutions and Trade Evolutions. Both of these can be triggered whenever the player wants, and will still grant the usual stat boosts. However, with little exception, Stone Evolutions will result in the Pokémon no longer learning any new moves through level ups. And while there is technically no downside to Trade Evolutions, those can obviously be difficult to arrange given that they require 2 players. The other methods for learning new attacks are through TMs and HMs. TMs, or Technical Machines, are used to teach Pokémon a move immediately, but the caveat is that each TM is only good for one use. Certain useful moves like Thunderbolt and Rock Slide cannot be learned naturally, which makes certain Pokémon wholly dependent on using TMs to supplement their attack lists. However, most of the coveted TMs are limited to 1 per game, meaning a lot of hoops have to be jumped through to naturally teach your Pokémon their ideal movesets if they involve multiple copies of certain TMs. The exceptions to this are HMs, or Hidden Machines. These are special TMs that teach Pokémon a move necessary for overworld exploration, like cutting down trees, pushing heavy boulders, or crossing bodies of water. Unlike TMs, HMs do not break after use, which is great, but the issue is that most HM moves aren't very useful in battle, and unlearning HM moves is impossible. So, unfortunately, your options are to give one of your Pokémon less than optimal moves, or switch them out for another Pokémon that has been burdened with HM moves. Still though, the sheer amount of variety at play here would be kind of remarkable for any video game, much less one of this small indie-esque scale. In retrospect, it's really no wonder Pokémon caught on the way it did. There's a lot of content and mechanics to dig into, a lot of ambition on display, and I haven't even gotten into the hyper-specific, obsessive competitive aspects of the game like EVs and IVs. I'm just a filthy casual. But between all the different Pokémon you can catch, all the different types, all the possible team combinations, and the plethora of moveset possibilities, each Pokémon cartridge can feel incredibly personalized, and this is further accentuated by the game granting the player their own trainer ID number, and even allowing you to give each captured Pokémon its own nickname. But the near-endless amount of variety belies the game's underlying simplicity, which is another thing that I think contributed to Pokémon's popularity among children. It's very easy to understand. All those elements and attacks really just boil down to one giant game of rock, paper, scissors, and it's usually fairly easy to intuit which types will work against others just by applying some basic science or common sense. Water beats fire, but fire will melt ice. Ice freezes grass, but grass Pokémon barely even feel water attacks. The game even makes a distinction between ground and rock types. Both are weak to water and grass, but while flying types are immune to ground attacks entirely, rock types are actually super effective against flyers. Because, I mean, think about it. Throwing rocks at a bird, probably gonna hurt that bird. Some types can even avoid certain status conditions. Poison types cannot themselves be poisoned, nor can ice types be frozen. Other RPGs of the time, such as Dungeons & Dragons and Final Fantasy, had been using elemental affinities as a tertiary gameplay mechanic for years, but Pokémon makes it the entire central strategy, and this creates a simple yet engaging gameplay loop that makes kids feel smart for figuring it out. It's downright addicting at times. And the game wastes no time teaching you. Each of the 3 starter Pokémon fit a certain element that forms a traditional rock, paper, scissors triangle. Bulbasaur is a grass type that's strong against Squirtle, the water type, who in turn is strong against Charmander, the fire type, and then we loop back around to Bulbasaur. The game also makes sure that your recurring rival character will always choose the starter that's strong against yours, and while this won't matter for your first fight with him, where your Pokémon only know basic scratch and tackle attacks, the game still encourages you to think up team-building strategies to counter your rival from very early on. And beyond just their typing, each starter also more or less acts as their own difficulty selection. Bulbasaur is strong against the first 2 gym leaders as well as the final one, neutral or resistant to the middle 3, and is only outright weak to the 6th and 7th gyms. Squirtle is strong against the 1st, 7th, and 8th gyms, weak to the 3rd and 4th, and is neutral towards the rest. Meanwhile, Charmander is at an early game disadvantage against the first 2 gyms, and only has an outright advantage against 1 gym in total. Your starter choice therefore affects your early and mid-game team-building strategies to fill these gaps in strengths and weaknesses. As mentioned before, certain Pokémon also have a mix of 2 elements, which is also factored into their list of weaknesses, and makes things just that extra bit more complex. And that brings us to the gym leaders. Your primary goal in Pokémon is not actually collecting all the monsters, that's merely a secondary, optional objective you can set out for on the way to the end of the game. In fact, it's really more of a tertiary goal, since your secondary goal is to stop Team Rocket, but in any case, to actually finish Pokémon, you need to defeat the 8 Pokémon gym leaders to earn Pokémon League badges that will allow you to challenge the Elite Four, a group of powerful Pokémon trainers, in hopes of being crowned the Pokémon World Champion. But mechanically, gyms also serve another important purpose. In creating a game where players can trade Pokémon from one player to the next, they had to make sure new players couldn't take shortcuts to completely steamroll the game. While there are advantages to using traded Pokémon in battle, namely that they get a 50% increase to the EXP they gain, a few limitations have been put in place when it comes to trading. The first is that the player must earn the corresponding badges from gym leaders before they're allowed to use those HM moves I talked about earlier, the ones that allow you to cross certain obstacles on the map. Secondly, traded Pokémon above certain level thresholds will only listen to trainers who have enough badges. Every badge gained either grants access to one of those HMs, or raises the level cap of obedient Pokémon. Designing the game with these safeguards in place prevents players from just trading over an endgame Pokémon to sequence break or make the entire game a cakewalk. But gyms also serve more subtle game design purposes as well. For one thing, each one tends to introduce the player to a new type of Pokémon they likely haven't had many chances to encounter before. When the game starts off, the player is mostly fighting weak little bug types, but the very first gym introduces them to rock Pokémon, which are, as you might expect, incredibly hardy. And unless you chose the water or grass starters, the game hasn't provided you with a simple way to exploit any of their weaknesses. Shortly after this, the game makes you pass through a mountain area where you can catch one of those rock types for yourself. And so they've essentially given you a showcase of the type before giving you a chance to try it out for yourself. But then the next gym is a water gym, which is super effective against rock types. By doing this, the game is teaching the player that you can't rely on any one single type of Pokémon, and that finding a balanced team to cover all your bases is the best way to play. And with the exception of one, every gym in the game is strong against the previous gym's type. Misty is strong against Brock, but Lieutenant Surge could destroy Misty. Likewise, Lieutenant Surge would have a bit of trouble against Erica, whose grass types have an inherent resistance to electric moves, so on and so forth. Once you're past the first 2 gyms, they even start to challenge you in terms of simple traversal by each featuring some sort of gimmick, like teleporters or invisible walls. And once you've beaten a few gyms and gotten access to a few HMs, the game really opens up, with basically the entire bottom half of the game's map being non-linear. After teaching you the basics of elements and team building, the game finally takes the training wheels off and lets you roam wherever you want and figure things out for yourself. And all throughout the game, you're continuously running into your childhood rival, who challenges you to Pokémon battles. And these fights act as good gauges for where the player should be at each point in the game. Your rival's team grows and improves every time you run into him, and so he serves as a good gatekeeper to make sure you're not underleveled, as well as an example of a fundamental, effective team-building strategy. But while I said that Pokémon feels complex, I'd be lying if I said the game felt particularly deep. The focus on elemental affinities and one-on-one turn-based combat means that playing well results in most matches ending in a single attack. On the one hand, this contributes to the game's ridiculously addictive gameplay loop. When you defeat an opponent in a single move, you feel powerful. When you do it to multiple opponents in a row, you feel unstoppable. On the other hand, this also can make the game feel somewhat shallow. The fact that most matchups can be resolved in a single attack means that faster Pokémon have an almost inherent advantage over slower ones. Each of the possible enemy trainer types tend to fit a theme where they only use one or two types of Pokémon that the player can eventually learn to predict, and you can also save the game at any point outside of battle, meaning punishment for failure is minimal. This can sometimes result in the player cutting through entire swaths of trainers using only one or two Pokémon, and over time I began to notice that most of the challenge in the game comes not from the demand for clever battle tactics, but rather in just overwhelming the player with an overabundance of trainer battles that result in either excessive resource drain to restore lost HP and PP, or time spent making frequent trips back to the nearest Pokémon Center, this game's version of INS. There are also, unfortunately, quite a few issues when it comes to game balance. Firstly, and this is really just a personal nitpick, but I've started to question the decision of making money in this game so hard to come by. While Pokémon don't drop money like in other RPGs, you only get money from trainer battles, which are finite. There are other minor methods of obtaining pocket change, like the payday attack, and Pokémon Center stays are thankfully free of charge anyway, but I imagine it isn't impossible for a player to find themselves with very limited cash if they don't play their cards right. Your inventory is also limited. Your on-person backpack can only hold 20 total items, and your PC only holds 50. There are maybe a dozen key items throughout the game that are required for progress and that can't be disposed of once they're unneeded, and in all 3 of the Pokemon games I played for this video, there was more than one instance of me being completely full up on items in both my backpack and PC. Your PC also holds several Pokémon storage boxes, but the game doesn't notify you when a box becomes full until you actually try to throw another Pokéball. Imagine finally hunting down that rare Pokémon you've been looking for, only to be forced to let it go once the game tells you there's no more room. Also, minor complaint, but I think the Good Rod and Super Rod locations should be swapped. The way it is now, you're likely to get the Super Rod first unless you're specifically trying not to. But more so than money and item woes, if you zoom out and look at the game with a wide lens, it starts to become clear that certain Pokemon types just don't have much general use. Ground types have advantage over 4 different types in addition to complete immunity to electricity, but most ground-type Pokemon don't actually learn ground-type moves without using TMs, and they're also weak to the extremely common water type. Fire types, despite being popular and having a lot of inherent cool factor, are pretty scarce and are only strong against 3 other elements that aren't particularly common nor strong in general. Poison types suffer from generally poor stats and are both good and bad against bug types for some reason, and they have a crippling weakness to Psychic. And Psychic is by far the most broken Pokemon type in the game. They tend to have horribly inflated special stats, which is counted both offensively and defensively here, making counter strategies against them tricky. They're also notably only weak to one type, Bug, but Bug-type Pokemon are notoriously weak. The strongest offensive Bug-type attack has a paltry 30 base power, and Bugs have no other advantages to speak of other than also being strong against Grass types. Psychic types being overclocked like this unfortunately means that fighting and poison types don't see a lot of general use as they're both weak to Psychic as well, and while ghost types were meant to have the advantage against Psychic types, the devs made the boneheaded decision to make the only 3 ghost Pokemon in the game half poison, and a programming bug made Psychic immune to ghost type attacks anyway, oops. So, in practice, the only real counter to a Psychic type, outside of purely outmuscling them with another Psychic type, is to come up with a damn good defensive strategy and hope you don't die from their first attack. That exception to each gym being weak to the last It's the Psychic Gym, because Psychic isn't weak to anything. And why, oh why, did the developers seemingly insist on making almost every Grass-type Pokemon half poison? There's only one pure Grass-type in the game, and it's garbage. Oddish, I get being half poison. Bellsprout, kinda. But there's really no reason why Bulbasaur couldn't have been a pure Grass-type. Also of note is the Dragon type, which is the rarest Pokemon type of all. There's only a single evolutionary line of 3 Pokemon that are dragons, and so this rarity meant the devs felt it was safe to make dragon types one of the toughest in the game, which also applies to ghost types as well, for the record. Dragons are only weak to ice and other dragons, at least in theory. In what seems to be a design oversight, there's only one dragon-type attack in the entire game, and it always does a fixed amount of damage, meaning there's no dragon attack that can actually one-shot a dragon Pokemon. Considering one of the game's final battles is against a trainer specializing in dragons, you'll often have to devote to raising an ice-type to stand a decent chance. And while ice is pretty remarkable offensively, there's only like one good ice-type in the game, and it's Lapras. Lapras Supremacy. Lapras is the best Pokemon. I'll hear no arguments. And don't even get me started on the Safari Zone. In concept, the Safari Zone is kinda neat. An in-universe Pokemon wildlife preserve where you can still catch Pokemon using special Safari balls, but fighting or otherwise harming the Pokemon is strictly forbidden. There are several rare Pokemon that can only be found in the Safari Zone, but they're all prone to running from the player without warning. Having discussed the capturing mechanics of the game earlier, you should already know that catching Pokemon at full health is difficult, and now you can't even guarantee any Pokemon will stick around long enough for you to do so. On paper, you're meant to choose between 2 possible actions that will either entice the Pokemon to stick around at the cost of making them harder to catch, or vice versa, and then balance those odds against throwing more Safari Balls at them before they flee. In practice, though, whether it be due to a design or programming hiccup, the options that alter the Pokemon's catch or flee rates don't actually make all that much of a difference when compared to the regular capturing rates, and so the objectively best method for catching Pokemon in the Safari Zone is to just mindlessly chuck balls at them and cross your fingers. The Safari Zone is, to me, the most irritating RPG gameplay mechanic since the Veld from Final Fantasy VI. There's nothing more infuriating than finally finding that 1 in 100 chance Pokemon, only for it to escape the first Safari Ball and run away on the first turn, leaving you to start from scratch. The Veld is still probably worse, but man is the Safari Zone still downright awful. I know this is a low-hanging fruit at this point, but Pokemon's scrappy, low-budget nature does also unfortunately come through in the game's presentation. The gameplay may be addictive and clever and absolutely wonderful, but the game is not very visually impressive, not even for a Game Boy title, and its code is basically the programming equivalent of bubblegum and paperclips. It seems the team's pie-eyed ambitions got the better of them, as a largely inexperienced team trying to cram all their lofty ideas onto a humble Game Boy cartridge resulted in a game that's only barely holding itself together. Several moves don't work as intended, or at all. Psychic types are immune to ghost attacks despite the game claiming psychics are supposed to be weak to ghost. Great Balls actually have a higher rate of successful capture than Ultra Balls, despite the latter being described as superior and costing twice as much. But those are just the tip of the iceberg, really. If you start to pay attention, even a little, it really does feel like the entire game could just start falling apart at the seams at any second. The most infamous example of Pokemon's glitchy nature came in the form of the world-famous Missing No glitch, wherein by performing a very simple and seemingly innocuous sequence of actions, the player can reliably encounter powerful wild Pokemon on the shores of Cinnabar Island, including a glitch Pokemon known only as Missing No, or Missing Number. Encountering Missing No can cause strange things to occur, such as duplicating massive amounts of certain items in the player's inventory. Hello, Endless Master Balls! And should the player manage to actually catch Missing No, it could possibly corrupt their cartridge's save data. The Missing No glitch is one of the most well-known video game glitches of all time, being discovered fairly early after the game's initial release and being spread across playgrounds the world over. It's even explained in at least one official US strategy guide. There's another massive glitch that wasn't discovered until 2004, but has become almost equally as widespread. Similar to Missing No, the player can perform a specific order of actions to trigger the appearance of potentially any wild Pokemon, even those that aren't normally meant to be caught. Shortly after the game was completed, and after the debugging tools were removed from the code, leaving a bit of extra room, programmer Shigeki Morimoto added a secret 151st Pokémon to the game as a last-minute prank, the legendary Mew. Normally meant to be inaccessible to the player and only occasionally given to players at official Nintendo events, the Mew glitch, as it's now dubbed, allows the player to encounter a wild level 7 Mew fairly early in the game, and all without any sort of Game Shark or external hacking devices. And as for the graphics, Pokémon doesn't just look low budget or rough. There are times where I straight up can't even tell what I'm supposed to be looking at. Like, the electronic doors you see in Silphco and the like, why do they look like that? And why do they look different horizontally and vertically? Or these little paths, sidewalks here, like, what are these things? Guardrails? Banisters? And of course, there's the Pokemon sprites themselves. I get that the designs look a little off compared to later iterations, because this was the first Pokemon game, and so a lot of the designs hadn't been standardized yet. That's all fine. But even ignoring that, a lot of them are just drawn badly. The back sprites especially look awful, with the graphic artists using larger, blockier pixels to indicate that the Pokemon is closer to the screen, but as a result, a lot of them just look like amorphous blobs from behind. It's really a good thing the gameplay is so strong, because Pokemon is not a pretty game to look at most of the time. The music goes a long way toward making up for all of that, though. Junichi Masuda did a fantastic job in writing both bouncy, whimsical traveling tunes and tense yet energetic battle themes. Every fight feels intense from the very first note, and he even went so far as to make the battle music's intro more or less sync up to the start of the fight. There's even some more haunting or foreboding themes, such as those for Mount Moon or the Team Rocket hideouts, and especially Lavender Town. It's all pretty grand. So while creatively Pokemon is pretty darn incredible, from a purely programming standpoint, it's kind of a disaster. The team was obviously inexperienced, and combine this with the game's overly ambitious concepts, and you have a recipe for some messy results. Despite trading between players being the game's main conceit, the amount of data that could be transferred from cart to cart was severely limited. The team also didn't do a great job at optimizing or condensing the game's code, and so the cartridge ended up being absolutely packed to the brim by the end of it. This would make localizing the game into other languages quite the hassle. English and other Roman-based languages take up a lot more space than Japanese does, and the cartridge was full enough as it is. The entire game had to be meticulously reprogrammed to allow for extra text, including doubling the character limit for Pokemon names from 5 to 10, and Pokédex entries were extended from 1 page to 2. A freelance translator named Nabo Gasawara translated the game into English, and many of the Pokemon names had to be completely changed for the game's English release. In Japan, many Pokemon names are some sort of pun or portmanteau or specific cultural reference, and Nob would come up with new English names that would communicate similar feelings, which would then have to be approved by Nintendo's Greater Localization Department. I think the English version of Pokémon is stellar in a lot of ways. The gym badges in particular stand out to me. What were originally simple color-based names are now given elemental names instead, and look, I can usually understand wanting translated works to remain as faithful as possible, but remove from any context, which sounds better to you? The Cascade badge or the Blue badge? When Pokémon Red and Green initially released in Japan, they actually didn't take off immediately. They launched to somewhat lukewarm sales and critical response, but slowly word of mouth would build and it would eventually become a phenomenon. It was all the more impressive when you consider the Game Boy's ever-declining relevance at the time. By the time the games were finally released stateside in 1998, they had already met a fair amount of skepticism from some. A few gaming publications and trend analysts doubted that Pokémon would take off over here, dubbing it as too Japanese to appeal to American children. But those people would quickly be proven wrong when Pokémon Red and Blue came out in the US, accompanied by the Pokémon anime and card game, and became an instant hit, holding an entire generation of American children firmly in its clutches. Now, the swapping out of green for blue was not just an attempt to better appeal to American sensibilities. The American Red and Blue are not actually based on the original Red and Green. See, in Japan, the November 1996 issue of CoroCoro Comic offered a mail-in form to request a copy of Pocket Monsters Blue, a revised edition of Red and Green made to celebrate the game reaching 1 million copies sold. Blue would eventually be released for basic retail in 1999, but for the first few years it was only available during occasional mail-in order periods. In terms of gameplay, Blue version mostly just changed which Pokémon were available to the player. 2 Pokémon that were previously only available through in-game trades, Jynx and Lickitung, could now be caught in the wild, and 2 NPCs offer to trade Pokémon with you that evolve via trading, meaning it was now possible to get those 2 evolutions without a second player involved. The prizes available in the Celadon City Game Corner now include evolved forms of the Pokémon offered in Red and Green, and Ditto can be caught much earlier now in Rock Tunnel. And while the total amount of available Pokémon in Blue version is actually the same amount as in Red and Green, the pool of monsters takes from both sets. For example, you can catch Red versions Oddish and Growlithe, but also Green versions Sandshrew and Meowth. I'd argue the most substantial changes in Blue version, though, are to the game's graphics. The grass, water, signposts, flowers, and even menu borders have all received newer, cleaner sprites, as well as completely redesigned slot machines in the game corner. But more noticeable is that all 151 Pokémon sprites have been completely redone from scratch. The majority of these are improvements, but there were a small handful that were either barely any different, or where I felt the original sprite actually looked better. And all the Pokémon's back sprites remain exactly the same, and I'd argue that those were probably the ugliest part of the original game to begin with. So it didn't completely salvage the game's poor visuals or anything, but it is appreciated that they went to all this trouble. And it's actually this enhanced Blue version that our American Pokémon games were built off of. The graphics and even the translated script were all pulled from Blue, but the wild Pokémon sets were reverted to those from Red and Green. This is why that one NPC on Cinnabar Island will mention a Raichu evolving after you traded it to him, even though Raichu can't evolve. That line was taken from the Japanese Blue version where you gave him a Kadabra instead, which does evolve upon being traded. But in any case, this is why I find it funny that for so long people have considered Pokémon Green to be the lost version of Pokémon. I mean, aesthetically, sure, we never got a version with any of those original sprites, but in terms of gameplay, we did get Green. Our Blue is Pokémon Green. It's the Japanese Blue that we actually missed out on. Like, we can't catch wild Jynx in America. Nonetheless, Pokémon Blue would begin the tradition of each generation of Pokémon games including a revised 3rd version, which Game Freak would continue to do up through the release of Pokémon Platinum in 2008. Despite its slow start and localization troubles, Pokémon would go on to be a worldwide phenomenon. While it obviously remains popular to this day, again, it's the highest-grossing media franchise ever, it doesn't feel like it's ever quite hit the same heights of notoriety that it did during that first generation. That initial wave of Pokémania was unavoidable. It had parents and even politicians in a tizzy trying to decipher just what exactly this Pokemans thing was. Pokémon, alongside Harry Potter, even briefly gave a second wind to the satanic panic that had gradually been dwindling within American culture at the time.
And now you notice he's not quite so cute anymore, and his little satanic tail is really erect.
You take the bad with the good, I suppose. Pokémon is one of the only franchises on Earth that started from basically nothing and yet almost instantly, clumsily stumbled face first into ridiculous levels of worldwide success before it even really knew what was happening. And the staying power the franchise has had after nearly 30 years even surprised the game's creators, who at one point had managed to convince themselves that it was just a fad. But no, after all this time, it's become abundantly clear that Pokémon isn't going anywhere anytime soon.